Today, we're stepping inside a house in Pompeii that remained sealed for nearly 2,000 years. Let's see what it was hiding.
For nearly 2,000 years, this house remained sealed beneath hardened ash, cut off from the light and cut off from time. When the entrance finally came back into view, it did not look like just another forgotten ruin. It felt like a space interrupted at the edge between life and disappearance. And that is where the story changes. Because opening a place like this does not just mean revealing the past. It means touching the remains of a moment that perhaps should never have been disturbed. Pompeii did not wake up looking like a tragedy. The city stirred the way it did on any other day, with streets beginning to fill, workers opening their shops, water being carried, and household routines taking shape early in the morning. That is exactly what gives this story its weight. No one left home thinking they were living through their final hours. Daily life moved at its normal pace, with the kind of repetition that makes a city feel stable and predictable. And that is where the contrast becomes so powerful. Catastrophe did not arrive in the middle of chaos. It arrived in the middle of a living, working, perfectly ordinary routine. The first signs were not enough to break the logic of the day. Small tremors, dust falling from high places, animals reacting strangely, surfaces vibrating for a few seconds at a time. None of that, on its own, forced anyone to drop everything and run. And honestly, almost no one reads an incomplete warning as an immediate end. Have you ever noticed how human beings tend to normalize discomfort when it arrives little by little? In Pompeii, that delay in turning unease into action was decisive. The evidence points to a city that recognized the danger in stages, far too late to respond with any real clarity. When the eruption began to take over the landscape, the city entered a zone of confusion. The eruptive column rose above the horizon, the light changed, and ash started falling with an insistence that could no longer be ignored. Even then, understanding what was happening in real time was another matter entirely. There was no ready explanation, no complete view of what the next hours would bring. What existed instead was hesitation, observation, an attempt to carry on, and then the shock of realizing this was not temporary. At that point, Pompeii stopped being a place of routine and started becoming a place of desperate decisions. As volcanic material piled up, the problem stopped being just visual and became physical. Streets grew harder to cross, roofs began carrying increasing weight, entrances and passageways became less useful, and the house itself, once a shelter, began turning into a threat. That is where the story takes on a deeply human pulse, because no one makes major decisions in a laboratory. They make them in the middle of fear, doubt, and incomplete information. And that is exactly what the evidence suggests. People trying to adjust their routine to the disaster until the moment when no adjustment was possible anymore. Pompeii did not vanish in a single instant. The city was overtaken layer by layer through buildup, compression, and successive blockages that changed the way people moved and survived inside their own homes. That detail matters because it helps explain why certain spaces were preserved so powerfully centuries later. Burial did not destroy everything in the same way. In some cases, it also sealed, closed off, and immobilized the interiors of houses, workshops, and rooms. And that is exactly what makes the discovery of this house so powerful. The same event that interrupted life also protected part of its traces. After the disaster came a phase people remember less often, but it may be the most unsettling of all: the long silence. The city stopped being used, crossed, maintained, and changed. Above it, the world kept going. Seasons passed, landscapes shifted, generations were born and died. But beneath the surface, certain spaces remained outside of time. That changes our relationship with Pompeii completely. We are not just looking at ancient ruins. We are looking at an urban world that stopped before it could finish its own motion, and this house, buried for so long, carries that feeling almost brutally, as if time inside it had simply been suspended. When Pompeii began to reappear, it did not come back all at once. The city was revealed in stages, by sectors, through archaeological campaigns shaped by technical limits, priorities, and very different risks. Streets came back little by little. Painted walls re-emerged. Rooms returned to the light after centuries. And with every new opening, the sense grew stronger that the site held far more than scattered ruins. But not everything could be excavated at the same time. And that uneven reopening created something fascinating. While some areas were already under study, others remained closed, preserved, almost as if they were still resisting the return of the human gaze. It is in that context that the house at the center of our story begins to gain weight. The first thing that stands out is not luxury or grandeur, but closure. The facade becomes legible. The entrance is recognized. The structure separates itself from the surrounding area. And at the same time, the interior remains trapped behind hardened material, compacted collapse, and centuries of silence. That changes the scale of the discovery. Because a sealed house like this is not just an old structure. It is a whole context waiting to be understood. And when a place preserves context, it preserves far more than isolated objects. It preserves relationships, positions, uses, and interruptions. What makes this house so unusual is the fact that it remained outside the circuit of exposure for so long. The blocked entrance, the pressure of volcanic material, the fragile stability of the structure, and the absence of ancient disturbance helped preserve that space as a rare archaeological capsule. And that matters, because the more intact the internal relationships of an environment remain, the more it can reveal about the daily life that once unfolded there. We are not just talking about finding old things. We are talking about understanding how those things were arranged in relation to one another. And honestly, that is what turns a room into real history. The fact that the house remained closed for so long does not need to be treated like a legend. The strongest explanation is technical, and that alone is enough. Opening it too early could have meant losing the very thing that made the space so valuable: fragile plaster, ancient pigments, preserved deposits, original object positions, and even the structural stability of the whole setting. In archaeology, to reveal is not just to show. To reveal is also to expose, weaken, and alter. That is why, so often, the most serious choice is not to rush in, but to step back and wait for the right conditions. And that kind of caution, though less dramatic, is what makes an important discovery possible. By this point, the house was no longer just a sealed structure inside Pompeii. It had become a difficult decision, almost a point of tension between curiosity and responsibility. Every assessment of the surrounding area reinforced the same question. The value of what was inside depended on not destroying that value in the very act of entering, and that changes everything. This was not about forcing a way in. It was about controlling every stage so that the opening itself would not erase the internal relationships preserved for centuries. The closer the team got to the entrance, the stronger the sense became that this act would carry immediate archaeological consequences. When the opening truly began, it happened with far more care than popular imagination usually expects. No violent impact, no theatrical scene. The first advance was technical, restrained, almost quiet, removing layer after layer until a small passage of light could get through. And that is exactly where the tension rises, because what appears first is not the full interior, but a hint. Dust reacting, depth emerging, ancient color entering the light for the first time in centuries. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the smallest crack matters more than a grand revelation? Here, that was exactly the case. The impact of that first look did not come from anything extravagant. It came from the immediate recognition of a human space, painted walls still readable, internal alignments that still made sense, preserved flooring, domestic divisions that remained coherent. That may be the strongest point of the entire discovery. The house did not present itself as a pile of disconnected fragments, but as an environment that still held logic. And that logic brings the past uncomfortably close. Instead of feeling remote, the place begins to feel livable, understandable, almost recent. That is when a very specific chill sets in. This is not just antiquity, it is interrupted presence. As light pushed farther in and the interior became easier to read, the house began to reappear as a sequence, not as an isolated ruin. Entrance room, central area, passageways, smaller rooms, different functions existing within the same domestic axis. That restores a human scale to the find. The space stops being just an impressive discovery and becomes a structure of everyday life. And that detail is huge for narrative retention, because the audience is no longer looking only at what was found, but at how people once lived there. The house begins to breathe like a house again, even after nearly 2,000 years. It is the ordinary objects that make the discovery truly powerful. A container, a bench, a work area, a storage point, a surface used in daily life. None of these things were made to survive for centuries as treasured relics. They were practical, ordinary, woven into the repetition of domestic life, and maybe that is exactly why they work so well on screen. When they remain in the place where they were left, those objects narrow the distance between present and past in a way that feels almost unsettling. Suddenly, the house is no longer speaking only about ancient destruction. It is speaking about interrupted habit. But the house does not give us only preserved normalcy. In several places, it also suggests deviation, adjustment, an attempt to react. An object out of its expected alignment, a compartment that was altered, a passage made harder to use, an item sitting in what feels like a temporary position. On its own, none of these signs resolves the final story of the place, but together they begin to create an atmosphere of movement interrupted. It is not conclusive proof, but it is not a disposable detail either. It is the kind of evidence that unsettles because it seems to show hurry and hesitation at the same time. And that combination is deeply human, which makes everything hit harder. From the organization of the spaces, the finish of the surfaces, and the relationship between reception areas, work zones, circulation paths, and places of rest, we can read a great deal about the domestic profile of the house. It suggests an organized urban life, a certain stability, no extreme display of wealth, but also nothing improvised. That matters because it pulls the discovery away from exoticism and brings it into social history. What we are seeing is a concrete slice of the city, people integrated into urban routine, into a functional domestic logic, into a space used continuously. In other words, a living house until it stopped being one. The preservation is striking, but that does not mean the house was untouched. The catastrophe entered the space, hit the structure, altered passageways, piled up material, and left visible wounds inside. That point is crucial because it keeps us from romanticizing the discovery. What we have before our eyes is not a perfect snapshot of the day before the eruption. It is a domestic space struck by disaster and then sealed by it. And maybe that is exactly what makes it so valuable, because the house records not only the life that came before, but the collision between ordinary life and the violence of the event that ended it. This is where the most unsettling details begin to emerge. Certain objects seem displaced compared to the rest of the room. Some areas preserve almost complete order, while others suggest sudden disorder. There are passageways that imply movement and yet do not allow us to conclude where anyone may have gone. You know that feeling when a scene looks readable from a distance, but up close it starts slipping away? That is exactly what is happening here. The house says a lot, but it does not speak in a straight line. And that mix of material clarity and interpretive opacity keeps the discovery from collapsing into any quick or comfortable explanation. From this point on, archaeology has to slow down. And that matters because the temptation to turn evidence into certainty is enormous when a discovery is this strong. But a house like this demands discipline. An object out of place may suggest haste, but it may also reflect ordinary use. A preserved room may suggest routine, but it cannot prove the entire final sequence of events. The difference between evidence and hypothesis becomes decisive. And honestly, that refusal to overstate the case is what gives the video credibility. The power of the discovery is not in claiming too much, but in showing exactly how far the material allows interpretation to go. Opening a house preserved for so long is always a delicate exchange. On one side, you gain access, context, spatial reading, surface detail, and relationships between objects that would not exist without entry. On the other side, the opening itself changes the state of the place. Light comes in, air begins to move, humidity shifts, dust is disturbed, plaster reacts. It is hard to accept, but the very gesture that creates knowledge also begins transforming what had been protected. That is why opening is never neutral. It requires technique, yes, but also a serious awareness of the material cost behind every revelation. What makes this house stand out so strongly is not just the length of its isolation, it is the way it preserves living relationships between spaces and objects. A bench in front of a painted wall, a container near a circulation path, a work area connected to a place of rest. The strength of the whole lies in that internal logic that survived. The house does not reappear as a collection of ancient pieces, but as a moment compressed into architecture. And once that becomes clear, the viewer stops seeing scattered fragments and begins to perceive something far rarer, the full outline of a life interrupted in the middle of being lived. Even with all this preservation, some questions will remain beyond our reach. Who was there in the final hours? Did someone try to leave and then come back? Was there an attempt to organize objects before fleeing? What was left behind by choice, and what was left behind because there was no other option? It is striking how the most human questions are the ones hardest to recover. Material survives, but intention and sequence do not always leave enough of a record. And maybe that is what defines this discovery most of all. The house gives back context. It gives back environment. It gives back closeness. But it still refuses to surrender what we want most: the full story of those final decisions.
This video was a historical reconstruction made with AI, based on records from the period, created for educational and narrative purposes.
This case helps us see Pompeii in a different way. Instead of seeing only ruin, we begin to see suspension. Streets, houses, passageways, work areas, and private rooms remain legible because the normal movement of the city was interrupted before it could reorganize itself. The central house in this video works almost like a summary of that logic. It is not impressive only because it preserved ancient things. It is impressive because it still preserves the shape of a routine in progress, and that changes the way we read the archaeological site completely. Pompeii stops feeling merely destroyed and starts feeling paused, like a sentence cut off in the middle. After the opening, what remains is a double feeling. On one side, there is scientific gain, and that cannot be denied. The house offers data, context, and a historical density that is difficult to find in more exposed environments. On the other side, there is the weight of knowing that entry ended forever, the original condition of that isolation. And that tension is not a small one. Is it better to preserve absolute silence or accept the risk of exposure in order to understand the past more clearly? That is the central question, and it is far more interesting than any cheap mystery effect. At the end of the day, we are talking about a human choice made in front of an extremely fragile past. In the end, this house did not deliver a simple truth or a solved mystery. What it gave back was presence, a domestic space that crossed nearly 2,000 years while still holding the outline of a routine, an interruption, and an absence. And that alone is enough to make the discovery linger. Some stories stay with us not because of spectacle, but because of closeness. This house does exactly that. It feels too close. It was opened. It was studied. It was documented. But the full story it holds has still not allowed itself to be fully possessed. And maybe that is Pompeii's strongest mark of all. It reveals a great deal, but never everything.